I think I might have lost my cursor. Can you help me with that? Trying to thrash a key. While we're doing that, NASA is currently, I guess I'll put you with the mic. NASA is currently conducting two parallel groups of studies. One is to find what we're going to do on the moon, how we're going to get to the moon, and what we're going to do when we get there. The so-called Lunar Exploration Architecture. And that's currently ongoing right now. In fact, I just came from a telecon on that. We're also looking at the Mars architecture, which is going to be mainly the focus of this talk. Now, the Mars architecture studies have been going on for about 20 years. There have been several iterations of them, and we're about to start iterating on the next cycle. So that's basically what I'm going to talk about. But the point is, we're going to do the moon and Mars pretty much the same way, and that is to have an outpost at either place that will be supplied with cargo. In the case of Mars, maybe the cargo comes ahead of the crew. In the case of Moon, it's more of a coincident activity. And so as soon as we get my slides up here, I can show you what the action is. But the point is there'll be a linkage between what we do on the Moon and what we do on Mars. And that was pretty much a given from the President's vision. There we go. Thank you very much. So I'm subbing for Bert Drake today, and we'll talk about the Mars mission. And so it all started when the President proclaimed that NASA would be giving a new charter back away from doing shuttle flights to the space station and move forward to the Moon and beyond. Yeah. Okay, we're going to use the Moon to prepare for future human and robotic missions to Mars, and other locations. So the idea is you do things on the Moon as you will eventually do on Mars, practicing for Mars, if you will, but still doing useful things. We want to eventually extend human presence beyond the Moon into the solar system, and that include Mars and I'll just say other places, because we are studying other things we can do with the Ares launch vehicles. The last speaker was talking about economic impacts, and that's one of the things we want to actually is economic activity on the Moon, and how that happens and what the constraints on there was just, I guess, the topic of the previous speaker. And of course we want to forge international partnerships, because if we don't do it, others will, and they may not be constrained by the same rules that we are. And then of course to bring the public along with this. Needless to say, going to Mars will be a very complicated activity. We want to bring humans out into the solar system. A key point is that when humans go out to Mars, they'll be on very long missions, far from home, sometimes out of contact for long periods of time compared to what we experience now. But as you see in one of the other charts, the length of these missions are very much like the old missions of discovery, going back to Columbus and even before that. 3 to 4 years, 5 years away from home was a common occurrence. And so these missions will be about 3 years end to end, that is going to Mars. When we do our planning, we speak of putting together reference missions, and a reference mission is basically a set of guidelines, requirements, assumptions, and basically a how-to, a very top-level manner, how we think we're going to do this. And from there, you derive things about what the launch vehicles look like, what the landers look like, what the habitats look like. For the Moon, the design reference mission, more or less ESAS, the ESAS report that came out, I guess, almost 2 years ago now. We've since gone through one cycle of the Lunar Architecture team effort. We're now going through the second one. From that activity, we've got a family of launch vehicles. Now we're looking at how those launch vehicles could be used beyond the Moon, and also we're looking at things like elements for the Moon, rovers, habitats, logistics modules, all the nuts and bolts of the things you need to do. So you start with your design reference mission. Okay, I think I'll go on beyond that. So here's the evolution of our Mars design reference mission. As I said, it started about 20 years ago. There have been several iterations over time. A lot of us here were involved in design reference mission number 1, which was done in 92 and 93 and actually published in 97. That sort of set the ground rules, and if you look at actually the lunar architecture, it has a lot of heritage to what the Mars design reference mission was, and that's probably not an accident, since the idea is to do things on the Moon, that are similar to what you're going to do on Mars. There have been a couple updates to the design reference mission, some of this in some of the detail levels, but now we're embarking on an activity to actually give a full-up relook on the mission, so we'll end up with design reference mission, I guess 5 by the time we're done. Yes?
Could you help us understand how this has worked over the last 20 years? Should we see this? There's been I mean, I talk to planetary scientists and they think about this stuff here or there or wherever, but has there been a serial and consecutive and continuous research group for 20 years at NASA thinking about this?
There have been some of the same individuals. I wasn't around doing this 20 years ago. I was around on the 92-93 study. Others have been. I don't think there has been one body, as you see, right in the midst of Design Reference Mission 1, Code Z at headquarters was abolished for their reward. So I would say it hasn't necessarily been a consistent group. We've tried to maintain the corporate knowledge. For example, the people who are still here at Ames, Chris and myself and a few other colleagues, are interjecting our experience. For example, why trade certain things when we already did that trade? We're more looking at, given the capabilities we have now, for example, we have the Ares 5, the Ares 1, the CEV, what do we do with them for Mars? So it hasn't been a consistent, a whole group, but I hope it's been at least consistent in the fact that you look back what you've done the previous time. So I think from a top-level point of view, you'll see the same themes. Big things that came out in Design Reference Mission 1 was we're going to use ISRU, in situ resource utilization. Use the atmosphere on Mars. At the time back then, he said we hope we'd find water. Now I don't think it's a question of have we found water, but go best to find it to actually get it. If that's a true statement, Chris, would you say that we basically, it's given the water's there, we just got to go find it? The thing that surprised me about lunar is that there's actually the potential for ice in the lunar poles. So we're going after the water. So I guess the short answer to the question is it's been more or less consistent, but it hasn't been the same people every time. And it's been sort of hit and miss. Different studies, different size studies, different charters.
One more small. If you talk about this informal group that's been thinking about this for 15 or 20 years, how large of an informal group might you? Are we talking about 4 people or 15 or 20 people?
It's more than informal right now. It's actually at this point formalized. Even back in '92, in '93, it was formalized. Each one of these studies were formalized studies.
No, I said is it 4 people?
Oh, 4 people.
4 or 14 or 14?
Maybe 4 to 10 here at Ames. Maybe agency-wide there might be 100 or more. For the lunar case, it's probably more than 100, a couple hundred. I mean, this is what NASA's doing now, so there's a lot of people working it. Okay. Okay, one of the things I mentioned about being away from home, if you look at the telecom distance between here and the moon and back, it's a 2.5-second delay, and for those who remember in what it was on Apollo, it was sort of that, it was like some of the people on assignment in the war zones talk, and then they have to kind of nod their head for a while someone talks back to them just because of the electronic hop. So there's a time lag, but it's manageable. At Mars, your two-way travel can be anywhere from 6 to 45 minutes. And so you can't really carry on a conversation. And so if there's an issue that develops at the base, requires an outpost, immediate attention, the crew's going to have the knowledge and capability and the wherewithal to react in real time. So they're going to be isolated in some sense. They're going to have to be much more self-reliant than they have in previous missions. There are 2 types of ways to go to Mars with a lot of names: opposition class, conjunction class, but you pick your choices. Do you want to stay in space between Earth and Mars a long time and end up on Mars only a short days and then a long time back? Or do you want to go a shorter trip each way and stay on Mars more than a year? And those are the 2 fundamental trades, putting aside all the orbital mechanics, which are fundamental to anything you do, no matter what kind of a rocket or propulsion you have. And so the 2 basic fundamental trades that were traded back for one and are being looked at again is what do you want to do? Where do you want to you put your travel time? There are some who are saying, well, for the first mission, do the short route and for the second and beyond, do longer routes. So the risks for being in space a long time is radiation, no gravity for lack of conditioning, so then there's countermeasures that come into play. The longer stay, you're on the surface for a long period of time, and you need to make sure that your surface systems are adequate to support you that long. One of the trades that's coming out now, well, if something happens on the surface and you're in a long stay condition, stay on the surface and just make things work, or you go back into orbit. Essentially, you'd have a space station around Mars for a year or more. And so those are the types of choices you have. Looking at the durations, these bar charts show the stays graphically. On the right side, the rocket icons, those are Ares 5s. Those are the equivalent number of launches you'd need for one mission. And I'll tell you what involves one mission in a bit. That includes all the infrastructure and the people. The short stay missions would take double of that. Quite a lot more launches. And so those are the, again, fundamental traits. Down at the bottom, I guess, representations of what some of the other explorers 500 years ago were faced with. 4 ships, 3 ships, and their stay time, you see, is more or less equivalent, as I said earlier, to the types of mission we're talking about. And the two-way communication time was infinite because there was no two-way communications. This here iconically shows, or graphically shows, the amount of mass we're throwing, various options, various studies over time compared to what the space station will be at full assembly. And the options there, it's hard to read in that box, chemical propulsion. A/B means aerobraking. And that's a technique where you don't use a rocket to enter Mars. You basically enter the atmosphere and like MGS did or Magellan did at Venus, you basically use it and skip in and out of it to slow yourself down. So that way you don't need propulsion to do that. It means it takes longer to get yourself into an orbit. So that's what that means. NTR is a nuclear thermal rocket, and that issues unto itself development. Where do you develop it? Where do you test it? Would it be acceptable to even develop such a thing? Solar electric power is using the sun to provide energy to drive a plasma engine. And so these are and again, over time, these are the options that were looked at. So there's a lot of mass going out to Mars. Technology advances can mitigate this to some extent, but it can't do it all. The orbital mechanics are still there for you. These are a family of launch vehicles, sort of bracketing on the left the shuttle, the right the Saturn V, in between where we're going to go with lunar and Mars missions. The Ares 1, the stick, quite a name for it, is basically a solid rocket booster from taken off the shuttle fleet, essentially, and a liquid-fueled rocket on top. The pointy thing on the top is the capsule. We're going back to a capsule now. The Ares 5 is in the middle, is basically a 2/3 capable version of the Saturn V in a sense, because it has 2 stages with boosters compared to the Saturn V. The Ares 5 will carry within it the lunar lander in the case of the moon, or whatever it is you need to get to Mars in this case. It's more the cargo version, whereas the capsule is what goes up, joins up with the lander, and I'll show you more detail of what that mission is going to look like. You don't ride to Mars in that little capsule. That capsule is about 5 meters in diameter. I've been inside a mock-up with 6 other people, and it's okay until you want to start moving around. Okay, this happens to be a nuclear thermal rocket option. There's a series of animations that will come up as I click here. The first thing that happens is you launch your habitat, your lander, and your descent and ascent stages into orbit. Now, this is without crew. One thing I was saying, for Mars, you start sending vehicles, infrastructure, habitats 26 months ahead of the time that you use to send the crew. You use that time to get the things in place on the surface, get them into orbit around Mars, check them out before you send the crew. For the moon, you will in place some of the infrastructure ahead of time, but it won't be nearly as long a gap between your cargo launches and your crew launches. So there's a separation between one and the other. And so those rockets icons you saw would be spread out over a couple launch opportunities. We don't, in our wildest dream, think we could launch 10 rockets out of the Cape in 1 year, or actually a couple of months. And so there's a spread there. So the next thing that happens is you have, well, okay, now that's what comes out of the launch route. On the upper side is your habitat, your gear, the stuff that goes down to the surface. You aero capture in. That orange device is a sled. It's an aero to actually fly your way into the atmosphere. And at some point then the rocket propulsion unit separates off and does a soft landing. The lower icon is the same sort of thing because it does do some atmospheric interactions, and it carries your descent and ascent vehicle, but it doesn't go down to the surface because there's no crew yet. It's sitting there for 2.5 years waiting for the crew to get there. Actually longer than that because there's 26 months, 6 to 8 months it takes for the crew to get there. So it has to be there a long time, as does the surface stuff. So the surface stuff, you go ahead and land your surface stuff, and that just shows a representation of a habitat. There are many other things that would have to come down, power units and ISRU units. Now, at the next opportunity, 26 months after those things have gone on their way, you launch into orbit a crew transfer vehicle. That white element on the side is the thing that the crew actually lives in. The CEV, the Orion, actually takes them up, and at the end of the mission will bring them back in. It's more or less a taxi. This element here is what the crew rides to Mars in. Okay. Okay. So this is your stay for the fast transit, and then this is, I think, the long-term stay on Mars. So it's a 600-day stay with a short stay in space. You're off onto your Mars trajectory with a crew. Let me back up. When you get to Mars, you rendezvous with the descent and ascent vehicle that's waiting for you, and you transfer your crew inside there. Now there'll be a waiting period until you make sure everything is functioning right, but given the fact that you're there 600 days, it's either 600 days on the surface or 600 days in orbit. Okay, then as you go down to the surface, the craft that brought you, now it has to stay in orbit for all that 600 days, waiting for you to come back up to it and bring you home. So there's a lot of things that have to be in a lot of different places and last a long time. The crew lands on the surface. Now at this point here, it talks about a 30-day stay to assure that you can actually stay the rest of 600 days. But some of the trades we made earlier said, well, the safest place to be is on the surface. You just ensure you have enough infrastructure supplies to stay on the surface if you start having failures. Because the alternative is to go up and just stay in orbit around Mars for a long time. You do your in-depth exploration. You have 600 days to do that. At the end of that, you get back into your ascent vehicle, go back up into orbit, rendezvous with your transfer vehicle, and come home. And you end up in the little capsule again, slamming into the Earth's atmosphere at 8 Gs. So a lot going on there. Again, this whole cycle is interwoven. I think the next chart is going to show, yeah, this here is, and there's a lot of lines and colors here, but basically what happens, if I can go over here, the upper bar would be your first set of launches, and that's a cargo launch. All the equipment you need, your habitat, and that was the first thing I showed. You don't go until 26 months later with the second line in the light color with your crew, and then now you get into a cycle of cargo, crew, if you're in a mode where you're actually going to be staying there for many cycles, many launch opportunities, again 26 months apart. And so there were other parts of our architecture where we actually had not one but two ascent vehicles on the surface, so there'd always be two ways to get off the surface, but basically the key is you're cycling through an alternating scheme of cargo and crew launches. And I think as you get into some of the meat of the structure, you are launching actually crew and cargo on the same opportunity, because then that cargo gets split up across two missions. So to start out with, it's just single crew or cargo, but I think as you cycle through, you get both going on. It goes on for as long as you want to until you decide to go somewhere else. But the point is, you'll be base on Mars. So if you want to go another base on Mars, you have to do another startup cycle to do this. And nominally, this was, let me see, it says 2014 there on the chart, 2016. Well, that's probably a bit optimistic. Actually, when we did design reference mission number 1, the first cargo launch, that first line there was supposed to happen this year. Okay, so this is your sequence of habitats coming down to the surface, and there's that 30-day thing again, which is sort of problematic. How you, if you're going on a 600-day mission, how you have an option to stay only 30 days, but that's something to.
So the planning here then is not for a one-time going and coming, but to start out by establishing a permanent basis on
Right,
Mars?
that's key. Yeah, we're not going there for one time. It's not going to be Apollo on the moon. I mean, yeah, it's not going to be Apollo. It's going to be a cyclic event.
What about rovers and ability on the surface?
That's part of it. All that. When I say cargo, that's read rovers, supplies. Although you want to live off the land, use sort of a regenerable life support system if you can.
Can you say a little bit about the redundancies? About what the thinking is about redundancies here and possible rescue missions if something goes wrong?
The redundancy comes from when I mentioned possibly having a second ascent vehicle ready. So maybe you take another ascent vehicle with you, and maybe that ascent vehicle I showed in the first thing where it stayed in orbit, maybe it goes ahead, goes down by itself, and so it's already on the surface. And the idea is if there were an ISRU plant available, then it could refuel itself, or maybe in later cycles. So the redundancy would just be providing, more things. As far as rescue missions, at 26 months apart, and given, if something goes wrong 300 days into the mission, there's no way to rescue anyone. That's why I said you're on your own.
Sorry, I didn't mean so much about the discrete issues, but you guys must be coming up with a philosophy of redundancy, because what? 30% of the things are going to break or not ever work, right?
Yeah, the way you'd handle that was you provide spares and provide the crew the capability to fix things. The crew size, by the way, if I can kind of segue into that, just jump into that. I think in our study we talked about having 6 people on a crew. For the moon it's going to be 4, by the way. There's others who say 8. And one of the things you have to look at is cross-training. What happens if the doctor gets sick? Who's the doctor? What happens if the electrical engineer, burns his fingers and he can't work on the circuits? Who does that? So that goes in the crew size. So that's another redundancy. But if you want dual redundancy, you have to 2 of everything. And then by going in the staggered amount, if you just increase the amount of mass you throw there, that's where you get redundancy, by just putting more vehicles on the surface. And that dual ascent vehicle is just one. The other thing that happens, the very first one, of course, there's not much opportunity for redundancy because you're the first one. But once the cycle gets going, then you might have 2 of everything. You cycle through, and you use the older of the 2 units that are available every time.
I'm a little surprised you're talking so often about having 2 of everything, because I would have guessed that you would be thinking about things like there would be things modularized, so one thing could be many different things with modifications.
That's something, that we would have to look at. So I guess I'm at a higher, talking at a top level functional block diagram than you are. But yeah, certainly we did a lot of thinking about spare parts, and I think that's what you may be getting at. Something that can, I don't know if you could have a radio receiver turn into some other function, but I guess that's what you're talking about.
So in some sense you'd have 20 of something.
Yeah, but that just dries up the mass. So those are the types of trades that you do when you come up with these mission designs. Right now, for the lunar mission, we're fighting to drive down the mass wherever we can.
Do you include issues, economics issues and political issues for, if this is a permanent base, then there's going to be constant investment, and what percentage of it, of the GDP in the United States, is going to be the constant commitment that we've made?
Well, I work here. I don't work in Washington, and those are the type of people who have to decide those questions.
But you have to give them the numbers.
Right, we have to give them the.
What numbers is it going to take?
Well, for example,
GDP?
one thing, Mike Griffin wrote an article for Aviation Week. It came out about a couple weeks ago now, and he said, it's dangerous to predict 50 years in the future, but he made the analogy that if NASA's budget is not much bigger than it has historically been given 10-year cycles, that we could do 2.5, 3 lunar-sized programs. And so without any further investment, that was his first top-level cut about what he thought we could do. The whole vision is supposed to be sustainable and affordable, and how you cut that, I don't know. We can give them the numbers, but it's up to the legislature to say we don't like those numbers, or we want to stretch things out, or other countries can make their.
Sustainable means you're going to have some income from it.
Sustainable means we can keep doing it. The economic part, I'm hopeful that we can entice companies to do economic operations on the moon, mining, power, what have you. As far as Mars, I just can't think that far ahead for what would be economically feasible on Mars. Okay. Okay, then we have some technologies we have to worry about, keeping people healthy and happy. Habitation systems, we're starting to look more and more at inflatables. If not for the entire structure, at least you have to bring structures together, and of course it's level, so you use flexible docking tunnels to bridge between the structures. Advanced life support is how I got into the space business here. This happens to be showing wheat, I think it is, to be a source of food, to recycle carbon dioxide and bring back oxygen. Bioregenerative life support system. And I even started hearing people with the lunar team starting to talk about this again. And then someone talk about rovers, so EVA and surface mobility. And surface mobility, last year, is more than just moving people around. You have to move these landers. If you have two habitats that have to be joined together eventually as your base gets bigger and bigger, you land them, and you can't land them next to each other because you can't navigate that well, number one. Even if you could, you're going to blow dust all over them. And there were some issues with Apollo doing that for, Apollo 12 did that to Surveyor 3. And so you have to move things around, big loads around. The space transportation arena, back when we did the study back in '93, we postulated heavy lift launchers of certain capabilities. I think Energia was around, and of course we had shuttle. But now we have at least the design on the table, which is being worked for the Ares 5, Ares 1, and the Orion, and a lander. So now, back then we were looking forward to launchers that might be. Now we're looking forward to launchers that we think we have. Designs and what would there be, what the limits of those launchers are. So it's a little different mindset now. In situ resource utilization, to pick one, is something that we can start doing on the moon if we start finding water, but we'll probably have to do it big time on Mars. If not just to reduce the mass, but also to if there's something there we can be viable. The thing with ISRU is you have to kilogram that you can save that you don't have to bring from Earth. There's also kilograms on the other side for the machinery that makes that happen. So if it takes 2 tons of machinery to save 2 tons of water, it probably isn't as attractive a trade as you'd want.
And so, are there different? There must be different levels of in situ resource utilization, and you can imagine requiring only the use of the atmosphere. Easy access, no sample handling necessary. Different levels of in situ resources utilization that are traded when we look at this, or are we just going to have to produce propellant from raw?
No, I think I don't think it's a case of one or the other. I think it's a lot of different options are in play. The atmosphere, carbon monoxide can be burned, not very efficiently, but it can be. There are recent findings are finding possibility, if I say this right, of methane in the atmosphere, which is controversial. Emphasized, but or maybe they're available. And the water issue, if you have sufficient energy, you can break down water into oxygen and hydrogen and make rocket fuel, or run it through fuel cells to get it back. During the day, you break down the water. During the night, you use that in a cyclic manner. So I think you have to look at everything. And to show here, advanced power, solar powers, energy sources. Nuclear power doesn't show up in this chart, and that's probably a controversial issue, but for this type of mission I would say you have to be pretty flush with energy in order to make the system work. Our comm networks need to be there. Even though you can't talk in real time, you still need to be able to make contact and get information back. Mission control won't be mission control in the sense that it is now. They'll still be there. be able to, back and forth live. Sensors and instrumentation technology, I mean, these are just all the things that you would expect to need for either robotic. You won't always be out on EVA. You'll be doing things with you might have a fleet of MER-style rovers, or in another arena, I work on robotic airplanes for Mars, and so you may be using those to figure out where you want to go next. Okay, so thank you. This was, like I said, fortunately I had enough background in this, I was able to go through this not cold, but we are again starting up this activity. So how much time do I have? 3 minutes?
30 minutes.
Okay, right on. Can maybe just take 2 questions?
No, we have 25 minutes.
I have the mic.
Okay, I'll just go until tell me when it stops.
Hello.
Okay.
My name is Wanda Davis, and I'm here at NASA Ames.
Yeah.
And since this is an ethical conference, we're sort of considering those issues. I was wondering if NASA has given any thought to this scenario. NASA is going to put an entire architecture on the structure, on the surface structure. And I can see where that's elaborate, time-consuming, requires a lot of engineering, and that in turn requires a lot of time and resources. One can imagine an entrepreneurial company who says to themselves, we don't want an architecture. We're just going to take somebody there, they're going to touch their toes down, they've been on Mars. And they show up on your doorstep. What are you going to do if they need help?
Well, okay.
As an ethical entity in the United States of America.
Let me see. I don't know. Let's see. There's a model called COTS that we're trying to apply, COTS, C-O-T-S, for getting equipment into low Earth orbit. We're not going to have the shuttle anymore after 2010, but we still need to resupply the space station. The Orion has some capability to do that, but that's not really what it's for. It'll go in orbit, but it's meant to carry out these other missions. And so NASA's, in the words of Griffin again, trying to conduct an experiment to see if the technology or the capability exists in the private sector to start operating in space. And so I think the answer to that part of it is, yeah, we'd like to have commercial companies help us out. For example, when we move big payloads around the moon, is there a reason that NASA really has to own and operate all the little mules, my version of them, or chassis on the moon? So I think we would say, yeah, come with us and you can help. That's not what you're asking. No. I can't answer ethical questions. I mean, should we say be good and don't trash out the moon? Or I mean,
No. I'm saying, what if somebody shows up and needs help, and NASA has this architecture set for, X amount of people for X amount of time, and we ensure safety. I mean, that's one of our primary goals.
are you talking about like if they need to be rescued or? Oh well, okay, yeah, okay, that's okay. I'm sorry.
Has NASA even given any thought to that? I mean, I'm moving forward in the future.
Yeah, I don't think we've thought about that. I certainly haven't.
Excuse me, the answer is yes, NASA has thought about that and has had workshops.
Okay, I'm sorry because I don't have that in my.
When it's my turn.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry I'm not able to answer that question because I'm just trying to get us there, but I can't imagine if someone needed assistance and if we could help them that we wouldn't do it. Just like if someone got stuck in orbit, or Chinese when they're starting to go, I can't imagine we'd just leave them there.
Okay. Hello.
Yeah.
I have the mic now. I'd like to try to explore a connection between your talk and the previous one. And it goes like this. We're I don't know, what is it, 3 years past the visions that kind of started this latest round of thinking about Mars. And your talk is filled with space artist equivalent
Geographic engineering.
conceptions of the future. And as you mentioned, Mike Griffin's Aviation Week article sort of laid out the broad historical context for this in very economic terms. And that's been the big bugaboo for NASA is this constant dollar budget effectively. And I'm wondering what the ethical responsibility is to NASA, to the American people, the taxpayers, of thinking about these architectures that involve things that really haven't been done before. I mean, they build upon technologies that we know about and so on, but the cost of this Mars mission, is it known to within a factor of 2 or 5 or anything like that? And do we know that this isn't, I mean, is there due diligence applied to the taxpayer, that all these activities are actually going to result in something like this? And that's just a question. I'm kind of naive on
Well,
many
I guess
elements
the
of
answer is, for a lot of these things, I mean, you don't know what the, unintended consequences. You won't know what you find until you get there in a lot of cases. Just less the original discoveries didn't really know what they were going to find. They had suspicions, but the reason we go to the moon is because I think that there's going to be some payoff there economically. I think we'll find some sort of way to create energy, resources. We have issues now with potential environmental effects on the Earth. That's all I guess I can say is, and maybe if there's a way to solve that, help that out, that's a good thing. As far as Mars, one of the other points that is often made is if you're a one-world species, you're at risk.
Just to comment on this lady's question, you have a model for her question going on right now at Devon Island. So maybe Chris or some of the others know, but the Mars Society has a flashline center, 100 yards away from where NASA is at Devon, and they don't really talk to each other. So Flashline doesn't have the resources and all of the support and the emergency stuff that NASA has at their site at Devon. So the question is, if an emergency happened with the Mars Society crowd and they needed to be evacuated out, or they needed help beyond what Flashline and the Mars Society could provide, would NASA turn them down? Would they not help them? Would they help them? Maybe the people who've been to Devon, if there are any in the room, could actually answer.
Let me address that. You've got a good point, but slightly different from what you say. In fact, the operational agency in the Arctic is not NASA. It's the Canadian Polar Continental Shelf Project. And if FMARS has a problem, or at Devon, or the NASA activity at HMP has a problem, the Polar Continental Shelf Project is responsible for flying and rescuing them. And every day, everyone in the field calls up Polar Continental Shelf and checks in and says, we're okay, don't save us. So there is a government agency that has oversight of all activities in the Arctic and would be responsible for rescuing them. But a better analog to Wanda's question is actually Antarctica, where the United States has a base at South Pole, and tourists come by and want to buy fuel and generally, or if they're in trouble, want NSF to rescue them. And NSF's policy is that it will not cooperate with private expeditions, but it will rescue them if they're in trouble, which means it generally will not sell you fuel. If you fly your plane to South Pole and want to buy fuel from NSF, they will not do that. They don't want to encourage that activity, but if you're there and you're in danger, or you're put in an SOS, they will come out and rescue you. And that's a federal, U.S. federal organization, and that's probably the best model for your question.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, when I heard the question, I was thinking of previous talk, of business, which I'm tuned to, so I apologize again for not responding the right way to that one.
Like the Coast Guard.
Okay?
And then in terms of what NASA's doing now, since this is so far away from reality, it's looking at the policy potential and what NASA needs to do to make such policy. So NASA has asked George Mason University to look in this. They've had a couple of meetings in which they've tried to outline the potential safety, health, and ethical problems that would be associated with Mars missions, and recognizing, just as mentioned with Antarctica or other places, and therefore there's no decision specifically or who would be rescued and how it would be done, but at least the framework is being put in place to look at these type of questions.
Yeah, and I'll say, I think even at the height of the Cold War, there was an agreement between U.S. and Russia that if either one of the countries' spacecraft came down in the other country, in fact, they would tell them you know, they're going to land in a cornfield in Iowa, or they would, you know, cooperate, no questions asked. You know, just, yeah, we'll save them, we'll rescue them, we'll return them. You know, no problem. So even back then, when
The ship is ours.
Hardwood re-entry.
I want to ask a little bit more general question about the relation between scientific, technological expertise and a democratic public. You mentioned a couple of times the way we need to communicate to the public about this. Sounds like a very top-down hierarchical model. Now, there's been a lot of studies done about a whole area in science, technology, and society studies called public understanding of science. And in general, that model of experts simply informing the public about how it's going to be done has been rejected as not a very good democratic way to proceed. That we need there needs to be two-way communication between the public and scientific expertise. To what extent in planning the mission for Mars is this going on, or is it all just scientific experts deciding, you know, the different models here and making the choices and what we can sell to politicians? Or is the public, are there public representatives in your group talking about this issue?
I don't think there's anyone from the public here at Ames. There are other forums, Mars Society and some of those, which are more of a general, you know, they aren't all technical people. They're people who have an interest in space activities, and they've learned enough to be conversant in it and have their own thoughts. So that's as far as I think that I know of. NASA Public Affairs, I think there was a video or something produced. In fact, the target audience we have to we really have to concentrate is the people, the young people coming right out of college age, because some of which, frankly, still don't believe that we landed on the moon. There are still a small minority of college students, college-educated students, who question whether we actually landed on the moon, and whether they're just being cynical or whether they truly believe that. So I think that's the target population that we're going to have to focus on quite a bit. I'll say one other thing. When you said democratic, you know, the internet is probably one of the most democratic things there is out there. You can put anything you want out there, talk about anything you want, but yet there's a lot of misinformation out there, so you have to be careful. A relative of mine sent me an email, you know, oh, Jesus was terrible. I just saw a video on the internet showed how the Columbia really had an accident. You know, here's a video. It blew up, and Israeli spy satellites saw it blowing up. Here's the picture. Well, I looked at it. It was from a movie, you know, with the guy, the action-adventure movie, like, I can't forget now. No, it wasn't Schwarzenegger. It was Bruce Willis. Yeah, it was a Bruce Willis movie. And as soon as I saw it, I said, oh, yeah. So I sent him back a detailed explanation of what really happened. And he said, oh, yeah, sorry, I just heard from somebody else. So there's a lot of things out there. Oh, yeah, the shuttle blew up because, you know, it just blew up because, for whatever reason, but it didn't blow up. You know, it burned up. And so that was just an example that really torqued me off, to be honest about it. And I got into a big debate about, you know, that and other things, about, you know, just being careful about, you know, proliferating information. You know, you send an email, you forward emails to everyone. So, and pretty soon half the country believes the shuttle actually blew up, or that we never landed on the moon.
But back to the Mars Society. I mean, these are people who are you know, somewhat educated and sometimes very educated. To what degree does that influence what you do?
I've presented at the Mars Society conference.
Influence what you do, not what you presented to them.
Influence what I do. I don't know if it directly influenced when I'm designing or coming up with a concept for a rover. I don't know if I think about, other than I think about, well, eventually Caterpillar Tractor could build these things, and what's in it for the person in Peoria? Caterpillar Tractor can build hardware for the moon. Okay,
I want to weigh in on that, since, you know, we're both here representing. And I think the answer is not at all. And we have no mechanism to get feedback from those communities back to what we're doing. And in fact, in most parts of NASA, there's a wall. Not just not a door, but there's a brick wall. To blow our own horn, I would say Ames is probably the most receptive to that kind of input. But you try to get input into JSC and their engineering activity.
What's JFC?
JSC is Space Center. It's,
Mission Control.
Mission Control. It's Houston, NASA's facility at Houston. There's a reluctance to accommodate it, and an example of this is the Lunar Architecture was first being developed. We got an email that said, we're going to have a little meeting at LPI and come up with the Lunar Architecture, and the list of people were sort of the internal folks. And I wrote an email to the Mars Society and to the Planetary Society and said, you guys ought to, insist on being at the table at this. And that email, not by me, but got circulated in NASA headquarters and generated a little stir, and as a result, NASA canceled that meeting and rescheduled a big public meeting in Washington where there was more input. But it's a losing battle to get NASA to engage in these people who are friendly people. They're not hostile to NASA's mission, they're supporters. They would help build the case. But for some institutional autistic reason, NASA doesn't engage them.
Yeah, when the Lunar Architecture was unveiled last December in Houston, all the papers were from NASA people. They were all invited papers. There was no opportunity to submit papers or talks, and it was a big crowd. It was it was very showy and everything else, to say the least. But there wasn't really an opportunity for people to speak. It's a student session, but so that went fairly well. But
I have the mic, and I've been waiting patiently for a while.
okay.
I have some comments. I think this is a very important point. I hate to turn it off, but I've been waiting a long time. But going to come closer to home and ask if NASA can take lessons from its own experience. So what did you learn from in the big sense, the big picture of the space station program, and what have you learned then from something that's only marginally of interest in NASA, and that is Biosphere 2?
I think from space station, we basically practiced building a big complex system.
I mean in the design reference mission, in just exactly what you're doing.
Well, again, we had to put a lot of things into orbit. The launch, we have all kinds of different launchers from all different countries, from Russia and us. So I think the only lesson you can do is just handling big payloads. But I think the other lesson would be, I mentioned international cooperation, and we learned how that works or doesn't work. And we've learned how the other countries look at us, when we say, well, we're not going to have this module fly, or we're going to cut this station short. So I think it's not just, we didn't learn a lot about hardware, I think, so much as learning about working with other countries.
Well,
or not.
I would suggest that the lesson you should have learned is you can't design something like this. You have to build it incrementally and learn as you go. And you didn't try international cooperation. You said, here's where we're going. Do you want to tag along? So I don't think you've learned much about international cooperation at all.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Sometimes you learn from your mistakes, I guess.
How about Biosphere 2?
Just
Biosphere 2, that was first example of a it was a big closed loop life support system. They had their issues. They had to pump in more oxygen or whatever they did. The life support systems we would have wouldn't be a big world like that. They'd be cans, a 3 by 3 by 5 meter can, maybe 4 of them, holding 6 people, 4 people. That's what we're doing with. And so physical, chemical life support systems, growing plants, which hasn't received a lot of play right now. So I don't know if there's a big lesson from Biosphere 2 at all. There were a lot of, I guess, anecdotal stories about interpersonal issues. And
Can I interrupt? I think you missed the lesson, which is that you didn't learn anything.
all right.
comment on what he said is, first of all, you should have feedback from Polly Shore about Biosphere 2. It'd probably help a lot. And I guess you don't have small kids, you don't get that reference. The station has an incredible multinational agreement, which is a legal masterpiece of real estate how to work in space, and how to blend different laws and cultures and nationalities together. So this is, from what I understand from people, this model for the agreement they have to make station work is probably the building model to go forward for space settlement and all sorts of issues.
Yes.
And that administratively it works really well on station with the members.
Yeah. So I guess a lesson for me personally is, even though I consider myself more or less enlightened as an engineer to realize it's more than just nuts and bolts and rocket fuel, I still don't have the big picture yet. And so that's where we need people other than engineers. Maybe NASA needs to have other types of disciplines brought in to its fold.
I'm sorry.
There you
What I'm trying to do is to, what I think is bring it back to sort of my sense of reality. And unfortunately, I'm a NASA bureaucrat. And so I think in bureaucratic mode. And so to put what you said in the perspective of NASA headquarters is that the administrator has said that the lessons that he learned from ISS is, number one, that we want to make sure that as we go to Mars, that the critical path for doing that is by and large run by NASA, and that anything that NASA would farm out either to the commercial area or that the international partners would do would be either complementary or at least directed by a central organization, so to make sure that everything really fit together.
Yeah.
And I believe that that's what the architecture plans talk about. The second point is that the way NASA, and this is not in my area, so I'm talking what I've heard the administrator basically say, that the architecture studies are first looks at these things, even though that there had been previous studies before. And so what these are the plans that will be publicly debated and looked at, and additional changes will be made, as in the Lunar Architecture study, where it's not a fixed thing, that they have had sort of general overall pictures of what they want to do, and then the specifics have to be argued out, number one, but even the general concepts have to be argued out in terms of both what the public will pay for, what is in the best interest of the U.S. government, and how we can manage these with our international partners as well.
Yeah, for those that aren't, when the architecture was unveiled, there was one particular chart, a couple of them, that Jana Dale presented and said, okay, we need on the moon, and there were blue highlights on some of them. That's what NASA's going to do. But there are other things like rovers or other types of equipment that NASA's not going to buy and pay for these. And so yeah, there's that general, here's what we need, and the strategy for getting them is us and others, and work together. But and I sort of agree with your comment. Yeah, you can't design how the system is going to work ultimately. I mean, 50 years from now, that base on Mars is not going to work that way, but it'll be derived from what we put on there. It's our best estimate of what is needed.
We have time for one more question.
All right. You know, the vision for space exploration, Moon, Mars, and beyond, I think the first talk that Mike Griffin, the NASA administrator, made after that vision statement was that we want to do this with, you know, current or slightly increasing NASA budgets, and not tax the tax. And so John Logston at George Washington University has said, well, look, NASA gets 0.85% of the federal budget. It has for the last couple decades. They can do whatever they want with it. And so...
You said 0.25?
0.85.
0.85.
Right. And so the point is that you can do these grandiose plans to go to Mars, but the idea, I think NASA's it will be done within the available realistic constraints, if at all possible. Maybe we'll go to Congress for $1 billion here or $1 billion there, but you know, small change. I mean, which is a very, very different strategy than what NASA took when George Bush Sr. Came up with his space initiative NASA came up with a $400 billion price tag in the late 80s, and it died immediately, right? So the idea is this is supposed to be sustainable in terms of normal NASA budget process.
Yeah, and I think, we have our budget, and do we put it all in rockets and in rovers and not in robotic science missions? I mean, that was, the initial when it's okay. No, we'll just not have as much science, and we'll have more inflation. And there was pushback, and so that's, I guess, a bit of the democratic process coming in the mind. So that's, I guess, can dare comment on that. I mean,
Well, we could have the astrobiology program pay for all of it.
well, yeah, I'm just not going to say anything else. Okay, all right. Thank you.